Wait for the clock. Wait for the clock. There we go. I think we're running. All right. Not sure. We will find out as seconds go by. So I was playing around with looking a little bit more into the RPG Maker software, and I think it has the opportunity not just to enable to me. I think it has the opportunity not to just enable me to make RPG games, but I have the possibility of using them for a few other things. I think I mentioned before, there's some of my favorite old-time games that I just can't really let go of, and some of those are I might be able to rebuild or improve upon maybe for what I want. Some of my old favorite video games, including the Gold Box games, the Strategic Simulations Pool of Radiance, and I think they did the Heroes of Krynn series or something like that. Each of those had a huge chunk of my adolescence wrapped into them. And so those games had a fair amount of significance to me. They were basically, you load them in DOS, but they had mechanics that would be sort of like formative in my mindset of how I play or I prefer my games. And that's you have that 3-tier system that you see in a lot of role-playing video games, where you have the upper layer, like the overworld, the city map, and the battle map. And see, this is where the things get a little different. I played a lot of Dragon Warrior games, aka Dragon Quest. I played a lot of the Dungeons and Dragons themed Strategic Simulations Incorporated games like Pool of Radiance. And they had very different ways of dealing with that. So you do they both had overland maps. So basically, when traveling from one city to another, you travel over the hills and travel the roads and go through the forests and climb the mountains. That's not too dissimilar for each of them. Pool of Radiance, just as the base example, I used a small sprite, like a stick figure, really, for the most part, that just was a stationary image of the character that moved in squares to wherever your character is going. And random encounters would happen. And so you'd have a screen pop up for interaction with what you encountered. And it was possible to choose that opportunity to flee or converse or negotiate or whatever you needed to do to not always end up in combat. But then there's the combat screen. Now, you also had the possibility of the inside city screens. I should also state that Dragon Quest, Dragon Warrior games had that same overland approach, but their overland approach used a little chibi, cutesy, action figure-y kind of character. Big head, tiny body. Character moving through the woods and over the land and everything. And the maps were, I don't want to say less serious, but they were more cartoony in appearance. And they also had an inside the city map, and the approach these two games took to that are very different. In things like Pool of Radiance, the inside city or inside town arrangement was handled with 3 windows, essentially. The smallest window was a first-person perspective. And you'd hit an arrow and you'd move forward a step, and that would pop up a different still image of the town in front of you. And the second window was your party and the order they're standing in, and underneath of that would be the direction you're facing, so north, south, east, or west, and the time of day, and a few other incidental pieces of information like that. And then underneath of that was a window that could be used to display important information, like you see a notice on the bulletin board of a proclamation from the king or some such thing. And that was how they handled in-town interactions. If you walked to a certain area, you might see a figure in one still image, and then you walk up to it, and then they'd show you a portrait of the character, and then the window down below, they'll tell you what the character is saying. And that's how you got all of your quests. If you were traveling through a dungeon, for the most part, they handled it like a city map. Again, with that first-person still shot, party orientation, and data from what you're encountering. But if you saw a monster in the distance, it would be a small figure, and if they saw you, they'd start coming right at you. If you walked right into them by accident, it would pop up a portrait of the monster, and then it would give you choices in that third box down below about whether or not you parlay with them, flee from them, or attack them. And if you try to talk to them, do you try to bribe them or something like that? And that was pretty much how they handled anything that wasn't overworld or battle. Battle scenes went to a scene that was an overhead map with sort of stick figures, just slightly better than stick figures, of your characters, enough that you could distinguish them from each other and the monsters. And then you move your characters, like they have a movement range of 15 to 30. And so you move your characters partially or fully across the screen or the map of the room you're in or whatever to the location where you want them to be. And then you choose an action. Dodge. I don't think dodge was an option, but it might have been. Attack. Just cast a spell. Those types of things. Use an item. And those actions were your turn-based action, and then all your characters would do that, and then the villain characters would have their movement and their attack and their spells and all those things possible. I actually think that's one of the better ways to do turn-based combat, and I'd like to be able to reproduce that if I could. Now, games like Dragon Warrior and Dragon Quest had their inside the city views were your small character, and then they're walking through a map. It's very similar to the Overland map. Your character is just a chibi character, big head, little body, walking through a town of big head, little body characters with walls and streets and signs, and you can see inside many of the buildings. I think in later versions they may have, maybe even in the first version, they had a few locations that later became the standard of how they did later versions, was when you came across a room or a house that you wanted to enter, the top would be you couldn't see through it. But when you stepped through the doorway, it would switch it so that the room you stepped into, you could see through the top of, but outside you couldn't see. And it's basically a very simplified version of a overhead city approach. And they kind of treated dungeons the same way. And then when it came to combat was done with a look at the monsters in front of you, just lined up in a row, and your stats off to the side, and your choice of actions in a menu down below. And it's turn-based. You select what you're going to do, and the attack happens, and then the monsters get their chance to attack you. Much simpler approach to combat, a very first-person turn-based. But I don't like it as much as the Pool of Radiance approach. But I bring this up because it provides a few opportunities potentially for doing something a little bit different. So like the standard RPG Maker, I believe, is a type of game in which they're following more of the Dragon Quest model. You're going to have overland, inside buildings or cities, and battle modes that are very much similar to Dragon Warrior. So the Dragon Warrior games, again, have that overland, city, both being a chibi, big head, little body character moving through mapped out terrain and interacting with other figures like itself. Now, those are all fine and well, especially if I can customize the artwork for the characters or the monsters or the terrain, which it looks like you can pretty much do with RPG Maker MV. The combat mode that they tend to favor is that turn-based Dragon Quest one. They've done a couple versions of it. They actually have the ability to do it two different ways. The first person, where you're directly looking at 3 to 7 monsters lined up in a row, that you take your turn, you select attack or flee or whatever. You perform your action, they perform their action, and their character will do an animation of their attack, and it either hits or it doesn't, and your screen shakes if you get damage or something like that. That's one format. The other format is similar to the original Final Fantasy games, where you had monsters lined up on the left, heroes lined up on the right, and each side moves forward to do their attack animation and then steps back in their turn. Both of these have little appeal to me for their standard function. Now, I do have myself wondering if there's a way I could potentially twist it in a way it's not intended to be used. So instead of using the attack combat mode for attack and combat, I find myself wondering if potentially I could use it for storytelling moments. So it's an interactive, because the thing you get for that is, like, your monsters on the map sometimes don't even appear. If they do appear, they're these little chibi, big head, little body creatures. And if you encounter them, it moves right into combat mode, where you can have a large image of a minotaur or something like that. Having those options of a more complex, detailed image of the things you encounter, I feel like has the potential to be like those portraits in the Pool of Radiance game, where you're walking through the territory and off to the right, you see a small figure in the distance, you approach it in first person position, and when you get right up next to them, it splashes a portrait on that little window of it. If I do something very similar, you could do that kind of combat mode window pops up, and instead of fighting that person, this is where you do the role play or the conversation or the discussion moment. You walk into the town hall and you confront the guard and ask them why they have put a bounty on a character that's a friend of the party. And so you get up into their face and you have that conversation with a large portrait of the character, not just a chibi character on a city map. And so I think I might be able to figure out how to make that work. The trick is, if you're going to have combat in your game, you have to have another way of doing that. I think there's potentially ways of doing that as a more akin to how we do it in Pool of Radiance, where it's a map of the room you're all in, and you move your character to a new position, at which point they can make their attack, and then the opponent makes their move. So I think it's possible. I don't know for sure. Live combat seems to be one of those things that's a little trickier to get right. But if it's possible, I could do it turn-based, or I could do it live action, which would be a lot more like, it's a little more like a Mario Combat or a first-person, not first-person, a platformer, like a Mega Man or a, what's the one with Sheamus? I can't even remember. Anyway, Metroid. There you go. So you could do a very kind of Metroid style boss battle kind of arrangement. And that leads me to the possibility of also including platformer style gameplay. It might be a little trickier to implement. I've seen some of the issues trying to do it, but it doesn't look like they're insurmountable. And this is all like things you can practice with the basic program itself. I don't think much of it requires too many plugins, but ideally, I'd love to play around with that the MV3D plugin that lets me turn it into 3D. If you haven't seen the images for that, the RPG Maker MV3D, do a YouTube search for a video demonstrating what it can do. It looks amazing. And it looks amazing even with the standard chibi character artwork that you can use. If you are going to make your own custom artwork, I think it offers even greater potential. So I'm kind of hopeful to play with that a little bit. So combining a little bit of those elements, I feel like it's possible to do a MV3D approach to some things, do a platformer style approach to a few things, and use the combat mode maybe for social interaction modes. And it has a lot of potential to be bent, to be used in a few different ways. And part of the appeal to me of this is there's some of the, like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game, the X-Men arcade game that I played when I was younger. They used a pseudo platformer style. So you're in most of those cases, you're walking down a street or a hallway, and you're able to not just move right and left, but forward and basically moving forward and back in the frame by moving up and down a few squares. Your movement, if you were to push the down arrow, your character would move diagonally down and seem to be moving closer to the character in the frame of reference. The character doesn't necessarily get any bigger, but it's usually about a 10 to 20 step variance between top and bottom, something on that range. And that gives you the illusion of depth in your territory. Really what you're just you're taking your still image of your walking animation and you're sliding it 10 paces upwards at a diagonal or downward at a diagonal. But it implies that you're moving 5 feet back from the viewer or 5 feet closer to the viewer. And it gives you the range of villains can be moving left and or up and down the width of the hallway or the street. And so if you're attacked straight, you could walk, or if you move straight, you could possibly walk past a stationary object. Or you move up in a range and you'll bump into that object. If it's a villain, you can only attack when you're in a straight line to it. And so it offers a very different mode of moving through certain terrains and interacting with certain objects. Now, if I could get RPG Maker to behave that way, I may be able to do that zombie game, which was the first design I was working on last year. So I might be able to set up a 5-step depth field of movement with a side moving storyline. And there you can do parallax backgrounds. So you can set up a background that scrolls past as you walk. So you can do that. You can set the lower edge to be territory you can't walk across with drop-offs that if you walk off the edge of it, there's a downward force that pulls the character down. So if you walk off the edge of a map and you can fall, you can have the potential of, I have seen some people talk about using some minor coding or a couple plugins to enable jumping. I think in the zombie game, I didn't have a lot of jumping in place. I think what I had was climbing over cars and ducking, I think were the primary modes. Although I do think I, at one point, suggested the possibility of being able to push over a stack of boxes or push over a broken telephone pole so that it bridges a gap that you can then walk across. So theoretically, being able to do that would be possible. Might take a little bit more extra work to get it to work out right. But the other thing this implies to me is if you take that kind of side moving game and just flip it vertical. I remember when we were working on Cuddle Pop, the idea of having the swimming character moving through a pathway where things pop out and become hazards to them. That should also be possible. Especially if I can configure a jump button to do something a little bit different. Because that one was set to be the character is in the screen, in the center of the screen, essentially, right in the middle of a roadway, for lack of a better term. And there's a wall, and things can pop out. You have to weave your way around obstacles. But if you don't perpetually keep swimming, you're going to drift down off the bottom of the screen and die, or something to that effect. And so you have to keep hitting a button that propels you further forward a little bit at a time. It keeps you off the bottom of the scrolling screen. Now, I don't know if I can build an inbuilt perpetually scrolling screen and set the back end to be something that kills you if it hits you. Might be able to. And with those capabilities, we also have the possibility of doing liquid metal rage, which was the mercury ball that works its way through a labyrinth, and depending on the choices you make, you can't backtrack, but you can break the ball into little pieces and squirm it through other locations. And that might be possible. I can't guarantee that one will be as easily done. But the puzzle game that we were working on around the same time wasn't something I could do in BuildBox. I might be able to do it with RPG Maker, especially if I can control the appearance of the sprites for the character. So in RPG Maker, you have the ability to interact with and activate parts of the scenery that you play on. So if I just build a grid of tiles, and each tile has the symbol for whatever we were working on for that puzzle game, and I make the player character symbol the icon for the cursor, where you click on for that, it makes a playable puzzle game. It's not as easily clickable as a simple puzzle game for a mobile app would be, but it's still playable. And it won't be fast. It won't be like a Candy Crush kind of bang, 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 bang on a timer kind of thing, I don't think. Maybe. We'll see what we can do with it. But the other game that I'm curious about reproducing is a departure from the mode of gameplay that Strategic Simulations Incorporated did with their Pool of Radiance all the way through. I think they even did a Buck Rogers game and a Spelljammer space fantasy game. Now, I believe those had a space combat feature. I'm not certain about that. But if we adopt some technique changes, there was a game I used to play by Ambrosia Software called Escape Velocity. They came out with 3 of them, actually. Escape Velocity Overdrive, EV Overdrive, and then the third one was EV Nova. And those games were addictive. It was part of that shareware stuff where you could get a 30-day playable demo, and after 30 days it would sort of lock up certain features so that you couldn't continue to play it. The thing that sucks about it is the company's gone out of business and the software is no longer available, and you can't get the unlock code for it, even if you could find an old copy of it. So it's not playable anymore. But there are enough people who are huge fans of it that they desperately want this game existing again. I really feel like, for the most part, you could reproduce this game with RPG Maker. If you replace the standard figure of a character with a figure of a ship, and you replace the cities that you go into with planets, you could probably do you could do a fairly simple reproduction of this game, I feel like, with just that feature. But you have the ability to expand on it further, because in EV Nova, even the most recent one, EV Nova, had basically, you had a shuttlecraft, and you could dock at a planet or a space station, and then it would show you a still image with a button on the sides of it for the spaceport, the stock market, the bar, the jobs board, a few other like refueling station and upgrade for your ship kind of stuff. And you click on each of those, and it was really more of like windows with information on them that you can click. So if there was a job offering, you go, this looks like a good job, accept the job by clicking the accept button, and now you had a mission. If it were upgrades for your ship, they would potentially show you image for the item, but it is an item upgrade. It's just it's a shop, just like you could play in any RPG Maker game. But instead of a sword and a shield, it's a cargo pod or a turret for your guns. And so those capabilities are reproducible with RPG Maker. But things like the bar, the cantina that you go to, where you could pick up extra missions or mission chains, or hire an escort for your job, those were pretty much just text on a still screen and an accept or refuse button. We could change that to be something that you do as a person-to-person interaction now. And even more than that, we have the possibility of having half the game being about interacting as a spaceship in space, jumping to other planetary systems and making deliveries, fighting pirates in space. We have the ability to do that. And when you land on a planet, do a traditional RPG game where you have a character walking through towns, interacting with characters, and potentially getting into a bar fight, in which case we then go to a personal combat mode. And I was just like, the possibilities that this makes for taking that old classic EV Nova game and upgrading it are pretty substantial. And that's using the standard RPG Maker. If we throw in the possibility of using custom artwork and MV3D, we have the very real possibility of doing something extraordinarily different. It could be a real blast to play with. So with all that in mind, this is what I could do for game making. But it also gives me the thought that if I'm able to do ships flying through space, people riding boats, or walking through overland maps, I could do something like an Indiana Jones map with that little dotted line of the plane going from one place to another for those cutscenes like in the movie Indiana Jones. I could use those, record that happening, and use it as animation for a video, like a choose your own adventure video that I do on YouTube. I can use those combat modes where you have the large illustration of one character dealing with another character. I can use those for fight scenes. They're not going to be the best fight scenes, but you could use it for fight scenes. You could use it for social interaction and role play scenes. Dub over audio to the interactions. You could also do the walk through a city as a person scenes as animations. You could potentially do some of that set up where you build a stage, like a stage performance of a play. You build a stage set and you have your actors as little sprites that you animate for the scene, and you control the action of the character or characters potentially on the screen, and then you dub over the sound and dialogue of the scene you're trying to make. It's literally, you're able to build sets and actors and costumes for your characters and then control them like puppets rather than having to cell animate each individual pose, step, and interaction. And I'm like, that's got some real possibilities. But you also have to realize there's the possibility of making part of those scenes bright fluorescent green and then taking those images into a video editor and green screening out the green parts and putting something else in. So you can make some really interesting animation choices. And again, it's like more like puppetry than it is traditional animation, but you can get an animated look from doing that. And I think that's a real possibility of being able to do some things. And where this comes into play with some of the other stuff I want to do is for these podcasts that I'm going to be doing, where it's a choose your own adventure style podcast, I can animate and then post them to YouTube. So rather than having to do puppetry or costuming, build sets, do photography, I could do it all as digital action using RPG Maker as like an animation tool. And so I can make my stories and adventures and whatnot for the podcasts. And then when I move them over to YouTube in a month or two, a couple months, I can put some animation in and give it visual elements relatively easily. At least I think I can. I haven't played with it yet. And there's a part of me that's a little bit hesitant because right now it's $80 for the software, the base software. That's not including the additional 20 some odd bucks for MV3D. And there might be a few other plugins I might want to get that I think most of the plugins are usually made available for free. Some of them are for purchase. I don't know if the ones I'm looking for are free or purchase yet, but I can do a lot with the base system, so $80. I've heard from some people that they sometimes, every year or so, do a Humble Bundle where you can get it for a discounted price. The last one was 2019. They did a Humble Bundle, and I think you could get one of the more recent versions of it for $15, which is a huge break. So if they're going to do that, and they did it last year in the middle of October. So I'm kind of tempted to wait to see. I do think they offer a trial period for MV, which is the not the most recent. The most recent is MZ, but MZ does not have as much in the background for plugin support. And more importantly, MV3D works for MV, not MZ. So it works for the second oldest model, which is still $80. But and theoretically, I think I saw somewhere that you could do insert video files as like cutscenes for your games. And I wonder if there's if you could get around some of the limitations you might have to establish in one of the versions of the game by doing something different in a different version of the game. So where you'd have to use a certain plugin to do things a certain way in one game that wouldn't allow you to use other plugins. I wonder if you made a game version with one set of plugins, recorded it as video, embedded those videos as scene pieces into another version of the game. It's very complicated. I'm sure I didn't say it well enough to make it clear what I'm talking about, but I might be able to push the edge of what we can do, maybe even just a little bit further. But for right now, I think for the rest of the week, I think one of the things I need to do is sit down and plan a little bit more of what I want to do for the podcasts. Because one of the things I was thinking of is if I do one or two, maybe even 3 or 4, spooky Halloween themed episodes for one of them. The one that was originally set up to be trivia, but is now looking more like a which one is true, which one is false kind of game. If I do that once a week, I might be able to include once or twice more during the week some simple trivia about the topic of the main video. I don't know. I'll think about that. I do think the possibility of doing some simple trivia, as well as the which story is true, might be a fun way to extend the capabilities. And really show off the capabilities of the format as I go forward, because the format of just doing a story with a true or false at the end, it does technically show you what I'm talking about, but it also barely shows what I'm talking about. Whereas if I follow it up the next day with a 5-question quiz, so I did an episode where there's one story about a monster that a person turned into after being stranded in winter and eating the flesh of another human being in starvation mode. And I tell another story about the turning into the person you ate kind of story. Have those two stories, which one's real? You have basically the story of Wendigo and then something I made up. And I ask you which one's a real story inspired by real mythology and which one's made up. Then the next day we can do discussions of, a trivia, like the stories of Wendigo take place predominantly in the mythology of what culture? This one or this one? And then you answer and find out if you were right or wrong, and then we move to the next question. And I think that expands the capability of showing what you can do with that format. I think the one I'm struggling with most, I had an experience the other day with the putting away some of the stuff at the store I worked at. I had some of the things we were moving around made horrible noises that reminded me how easy it's going to be to make the 50-50 bad choice, good choice sound effect one. And the what did I just hear one, that's going to be a different way of playing that. That's not too hard to do. The one I think I'm sort of struggling with both of them, but the one where it's 1 through 9 bumps you to different sections of the audio track. That one's not super hard to do. It's just finding the right story to tell with it. And I think that's where I'm struggling with it. The one I'm struggling most with is the left-right audio channel. One of them's always wrong game. Figuring out how to tell a sequential story so that one option that the player takes always ends the story for them. That's harder to do than I would ever really be able to communicate. It's surprising how difficult it is to find a mechanism by which you can end half of your options a minute or two after it's made by the player. Like it almost has to be an escape or a chase. It's like a car chase. barreling down the street at high speed with somebody chasing after you, firing weapons at you. Coming up on an intersection, do you go left or do you go right? You're going to have to dead end or put an oncoming bus or something else down every wrong turn. You could do a corn maze. Make a wrong turn, hit a dead end, get killed by a zombie or a witch or something like that. They're almost always going to be maze structures. And figuring out a way to structure a story into that gets a little bit hard. And they quickly become repetitive. You kind of, the sense of what you're playing. And so you could skin it as a space adventure, and you can skin it as a fantasy adventure and a horror adventure, and you could do any number of things with it, but it's always going to feel pretty much similar to the last one. I guess. I guess the real question would be is it noticeable? Because the thing you have to realize is pretty much most choose your own adventure style stories pretty standard. There's a beginning, there's one ending, usually. Sometimes there's 2 to 3 endings. And then there's a whole bunch of wrong turns that eventually you end up in death. Sometimes you have paths that reconnect with other ones. But for the most part, you have beginning, ending, and a bunch of dead ends in the middle. And generally speaking, the format for which way those go, like if you take option 1, 2, or 3 in the first moment, they're pretty much the same thing. Like one of 2 choices, one of 3 choices always is a path that there's no coming back from, and it won't lead to the end you want. One of them probably leads to either death or reconnects with the main storyline, and one of them ultimately leads to death or the end you want. That's a pretty standard branching structure. So they all tend to look the same, but they're not the same. The story is what makes them different. So there's a part of me that wonders if maybe the left or right option story games might also be able to feel different. It just, when I sit here and think of them, it's like, it feels so restrictive. I guess I'm just going to have to see where I can make them go. So for right now, yeah, I'll see if I can build up some scripts and ideas. I think probably they're all going to launch in October because I am doing double shifts almost every day, like I knew was going to happen, and I'm tired. I'm tired every day. And more to the point, not just like physically tired, but just like I can't get my brain to get into the phase of thinking up stories. I just do not have the energy to be in a creative mindset when I get out of work. And I'm going straight to work when I wake up. So it's just like, it feels like everything's getting in the way of doing any of my stuff. But hopefully I can pull that back around in the next few days and see where I can get things going. Today's date is, yeah. Well, that's the thing, is that's part of what's building. Once we've started the school year, what we start is a not even really slow build. We just start to get busy, and then we get busier and we get busier. And the problem is we've lost multiple employees, either through them quitting because they just do not want to deal with the BS that the company does, or the people who were working for the company keep making poor decisions that end up making them undesirable as employees, and they are let go. We are severely understaffed right now. Usually what you would want going into a holiday season like this is 5 to 6 employees doing my job. We have 2. What you would ideally want is a manager, an assistant manager, a third position for management. I forget the full title of that one, and then a merchandising manager. So you want 4 managers, probably 6 workers. We have 2 dependable workers, 1 potential 1 day a week kind of employee, and then we have 2 managers. We're not going to be able to make it, and our workload is twice what it was last year. There's a lot more going on, and we're not as new, so more people know we're there. We're going to get hit harder. And there are definitely moments where I'm looking at my calendar and my watch and just thinking, how long before I can say I've saved enough that I can just walk away for a few months? Just say, I'm done. Here's my 2 weeks notice. I'll let you know if I want to come back at some point. It's possible. I could possibly do that. It's not ideal. Not in the current economic and socio-political situation we're in right now. But it's possible I could do that. But it's also something like, if I work a little bit more further into the year, I could build up more space so that when I do choose it, it's not just a month or 2 that I can do that. I can do it for 5 to 6 months. And in that time, ideally, I will have built out other projects where maybe I don't even have to consider going back to that kind of work. Maybe I can distribute some of my creations online for some minimal income. It's not going to be the same level in income, but it's going to be able to make up the gap between what I currently have and my costs of living per month. So that's just some things to think about. I would settle for half as many hours as I'm doing right now, and sequester it mainly to 2 to 3 days a week. If you could do that for me, that would leave me enough days in the rest of the week that I could pursue my own things. But I don't think we're going to get that. I think what we're going to get is no more dependable employees than we currently have heading into a heavy holiday season that just isn't going to give us a break. Not too keen on it, if you can't tell. But I'm going to try to at least launch one of each podcast idea by October 1st. And ideally, I'd like to do 2 of each minimum for the month of October. And the spooky story approach, I think I may want to do at least 1 a week, possibly 2 or 3 a week. We'll see if I can actually pull it off. I'm not going to promise I'm going to do it. I'm going to say I'm going to try. Because, yeah, the odds are not in my favor at this point. And National Novel Writing Month is coming up in November. I need to plan to do that. And I think October is Inktober, which is an illustration drawing month. Pen and ink drawing project every day. I don't know if anybody's doing game design month. I'll have to do a lookup. I'm working with half my computer capability right now because I still haven't got the laptop working again. And my spine is just killing me at this point between what I'm doing at work and then trying to sit at this chair every day. I got to find some better options. Oh, and I kind of want to see if I can do a few other things on some of my other channels, but we shall see. We shall see what the year brings forward for us. Until then, I'm going to call it here for tonight, and I will see you on Thursday for some further updates, I think. Until then, thanks for joining me tonight. I will catch you on Thursday, and take care. Have a good night. I don't want to go to work tomorrow. I want to do other things. I got too many other things to do to go to work. Why would I do that? It is what it is. Got to earn those paychecks, right? Take care.